thank you all for being here. My name is Zoe, and myself and Michelle, who's back there, are going to be helping out with the event tonight. Thank you for supporting your locally owned independent bookstores. It's with your support that we can host events like this in Boulder, so we really appreciate it. If you have not yet purchased your copy of the Poetic Edda, we have copies on display at the desk just outside the ballroom, and you can get $5 off with that red coupon that we handed you as you entered the event tonight. Just a heads up that there is not a register out there, so if you don't want to keep running up and down the stairs, you're welcome to grab a copy, get it signed and personalized, and then pay for it on the way out. We trust you, so no need to worry about that. If everyone could take a moment to silence your cell phones, watches, anything else that might make a distracting noise, that would be great. I'm going to do a little intro and then we'll get going. Jackson Crawford taught the Old Norse language, as well as courses in Norse mythology and Old Norse saga literature for 9 years at major universities. He holds an MA in linguistics from the University of Georgia and a PhD in Scandinavian studies from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where he wrote a dissertation on color vocabulary in Old Norse. During that time, he was also a consultant on major Hollywood films and television programs, as well as the popular video game Assassin's Creed Valhalla. Since 2020, he has been an independent educator using his YouTube channel and popular translations of Norse myths and sagas from Hackett Publishing to reach hundreds of thousands of viewers and readers with well-sourced information about Norse language, mythology, and runes. His research interests today focus on the relationship of the runes to Mediterranean alphabets, as well as the use of linguistic criteria to determine the date of Old Norse texts. This is also his 5th event at Boulder Bookstore, so for the 5th time, please welcome Jackson Crawford.
Thank you, Zoe. Thank you, folks. You may notice that in that bio, Assassin's Creed Valhalla gets named individually. Frozen does not, because Disney controls or wants to control when you mention them. However, it is fine with me if you want to mention me to anybody. So, let me begin with the beginning, as it were, because hypothetically part of this is a reading. So let me give you a little bit of the beginning of the first poem in the Poetic Edda, Volda's poem, and its account of the creation. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about what this book is, how the first edition came to be, how the second edition came to be, and then get into some recent research about it. So basically, if you've never heard about this stuff, I'm going to start talking to you. If you're a huge nerd about this stuff, I'm going to finish talking to you. And hopefully I'll hit everybody somewhere in the middle. All right, here's the first stanzas of creation in Volda's poem. Heed my words, all holy kindreds, you greater and lesser sons of Heimdall. You summoned me, Odin, to tell what I recall of the oldest deeds of gods and men. I remember the Jotuns born so long ago, in those ancient days they raised me. I remember 9 worlds, 9 Jotun women, and the seed from which the fate tree sprang. It was in ancient days, it was Umir's time. There was no sand, no sea, no cooling waves, no earth, no sky, no grass, just Ginnungagap. But Odin and his brothers revealed the lands. It was they who made Midgard. The sun shone from the south upon the stones of their hall, and the land turned green with growing plant life. So there we have our first hints of what is to come as the gods begin to shape the world. But let me talk, as I said, to start with, about what this book is. So much of the time when I'm called in to do a talk at like a school or something, talking to kids, I always kind of had fun with saying, like, who are the Norse gods? And of course, you get a couple answers that make sense and a couple answers that make no sense to you at all. But the ones that make sense typically begin with Odin, Thor, Loki. It's like, yeah, that's right. How do we know anything about them? And then you'll see the kids kind of give a thoughtful expression. And then my favorite thing is when a kid is like, I've got an answer, and you say, all right, what's your answer? So, well, I watched the Thor movie. It's like, okay. Well, it's good. I mean, at least you can identify where you got your information from. But I have been, for a really long time, interested in communicating what the information is that actually survives from the Middle Ages, because there is no shortage, believe me, you could fill this room with all of the books that have been written about Norse mythology by people in the 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries. But so much of what gets repeated in those books is made up by people in the 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries. What I want is to let anybody have access to what was written down in the 1200s, the earliest written sources that we have. The book's called the Poetic Edda and the Prose Edda. It's not my fault that they have really similar titles in English. Without you having to learn Old Norse. And this project began in the early 2010s when I was teaching at UCLA, because I wanted my Norse mythology class to be just primary sources. I said, you can find secondary sources. I'm going to tell you some great secondary sources you can read, but I want to hear what you find in those primary sources. I want to make sure that you understand those primary sources and understand what the secondary sources are building on. But when I first started teaching, it turns out that most translators, when they approach a book written in the 1200s, want it to sound like it was written in the 1200s in English. Right? And so you wind up with very, very archaic or flowery, poetic, anyway, language. Now, I have nothing against that language per se, but it is a barrier when you are teaching undergrads who are doing all their reading on the bus, the subject that you intend to teach them. Because what I found is when I would use these other translations, I became an English teacher, not a Norse mythology teacher, right? I'm just retelling them exactly what they just read. It's like, okay, yeah, so you didn't get this because it's 8 words or in places you wouldn't put them in this stanza. So I started just making translations, first of all, of the poems that I found most critical, and then eventually adding more and more and more of them, and just giving the students those as sort of supplements, and the students responded to those pretty well. And eventually, I started trying to make sort of an early digital footprint by making reviews on Amazon of books that were related to my field, and I reviewed a translation of Beowulf. And then this small academic press Hackett publishing company contacted me and said, hey, we appreciated that review of Beowulf. How about you look at our translation of Beowulf? Sounds like it might be more up your alley. And they sent it to me, and it was in wonderfully understandable, neutral, modern English. And I said, this is what we've got to do. We've got to not draw attention to the translation itself. Right? I want your attention on what it says. I actually, as weird as it sounds, one of my guiding philosophies is I don't want you to notice me as the translator, if you see what I mean. And Dick Ringer, who did the Hackett translation of Beowulf, actually rest in peace, he passed away last year, I thought I'd done just that. So I wrote back to Hackett and I said, I really like this. How interested would you be in expanding into Old Norse stuff? And they said, oh yeah, sure, in a couple of years when we've got something. And I said, well, I actually got a lot of this. So I sent it to them. They were skeptical about whether there was an audience for it or not, but they said, all right, we'll do it. And they published it, and it became a pretty big seller for them, to my surprise and to theirs, I think. And over the years, of course, I continued to translate more Old Norse literature with them. I translated the Saga of Volsungs, which was published in 2017, one of the great classic adventure stories. I like to say that it's the Iliad of Scandinavia. I published The Wanderer's Havamal with them in 2019 that takes one poem from the Poetic Edda and publishes it alongside the original Old Norse with a commentary on the Old Norse text by me. 2 more sagas in 2021, that was the last one that we had here. And then overall at that time, of course, I'm continuing to teach, first at universities, later on Zoom and on YouTube, continuing to research, continuing to read everything that comes across my desk, and keeping just this sort of running commentary for myself on like how I would do this differently if I redid this book today. Because I gotta say, there was not a point at which I had an absolutely perfect 100% knowledge of every single thing about Old Norse and Norse mythology. That is not what comes with a PhD. Lots of PhDs may tell you that, although it's actually more like people who don't have PhDs think that's what a PhD is. No, I mean, your understanding of your subject continues to evolve and expand. And mine certainly did. And at some point in late 2024, Liz Wilson and Hackett, who did the wonderful art in this book, if you page through this, I mean, the little initial letters at the beginning of every poem, the ravens, and the ravens on the hardcover. I want to take a moment to really praise how good she made this book look. She said, we are coming up on the 10th anniversary of that book. Why don't we do like a special edition of it? Because I think she was kind of itching to put in some more art. And I said, yeah, special edition, 10th anniversary edition sounds good. Will you let me like really, really heavily revise it and expand it? And I had to talk to Hackett a little bit about this. It's like, no, I'm not saying the first one's bad. I'm saying the first one is what I knew in 2015. The second one is going to be what I knew in 2025, right? And then maybe there will be room for one in 2035, I don't know. But like, let me show people what I understand of these texts today, which is going to be a little bit different. I also wanted to add some texts that are difficult to find in English that are related. And so there's about 60 more of the 100 or so new pages are actually poems that are from other manuscripts that are related, tell us more about the Norse gods one way or another. But in at least one case, I'm pretty sure actually had never been translated into English. So got some new stuff there, and I can talk a little bit more detail about that in a minute if you'd like. But I am pretty happy with the result. I hope you will be, as it encapsulates just an incredibly, like I was reflecting on this the other day, a quarter century of work with these texts. So let me give you a taste of some of what's new here, because I think that's something I haven't talked about a whole lot elsewhere. To begin with, there is a little bit more apparatus for the reader. The glossary of names is expanded, and it was actually Lauren's idea to move the glossary of names to the middle of the book instead of the very end of the book, because it turned out people did not realize there was a glossary of names. For 10 years, people have been saying, why isn't there a glossary? And I said, flip to the back. I promise you there's a glossary. So it's in the middle now. There are family trees and there's a map. Yes, I drew a map. I free-handed it in one day of madness. It is the result of actually a Christmas gift, which was a map drawing class with Brendan Warber on Uncommon Goods. I was like, I should draw a map of Midgard. So I did. And I added numerous new poems toward the end, and one of the most interesting that I think maybe actually hasn't been translated into English is called Lokor, L-O-K-R-U-R. So the bulk of these poems are written down in the 1200s in the manuscript that we call the Codex Regius, Poetic Edda. Now, whether they originally were composed in the 1200s, I can tell you a lot about why I don't think that, but we can come back to that. There, however, continues to be a long tradition of writing and telling these stories in Iceland after the 1200s. And well into the modern period, Icelanders continue to tell stories about the gods and heroes in rhyme. Right? They don't continue to use exactly the Old Norse poetic forms, but they start using kind of more balladic kind of things, the end rhyme poetry that we're fond of in English, right? Roses are red, violets are blue, inside I'm dead, and so are you, that kind of thing. And these ringworm, to my surprise, beginning in the late 1300s and especially going into the 1500s, I noticed that many of them contained elements that looked way more oral than I had expected. I thought anytime they mention Norse mythology, it's got to just because somebody read the prose Edda, because everybody knew the prose Edda. That no one's ever forgotten about the prose Edda in Iceland. People forgot about the Poetic Edda. But I started reading more of these and realizing there's elements in here that are not from the prose Edda and that I think may actually be reworked elements from much older poems. And we know that there is an old poem that must have underlaid this really famous story in the prose Edda about Thor and Loki. You may have heard some version of this story, but basically Thor and Loki abduct two kids on their way to Uthamar, or Jotunheimar, where the enemies of the gods live. And then they get put through this series of weird tests where Thor thinks that he's lifting a cat, but he's actually lifting Jormungandr, the serpent that encircles the world. He thinks that he's drinking a horn of mead, but he's actually drinking the ocean. He thinks that he's wrestling a woman, but he's actually wrestling the concept of old age, etc. And multiple elements in this story get referred to in the poems that are in the Poetic Edda, which predates Snorri. That's probably only a hot take to 2% of scholars. Maybe there's a few people who probably would say they don't. And so I thought, well, there's a poem here, and Snorri in the Prose Edda is basing his story on that poem. We don't have that poem anymore, but I think that Lokur, one of these rhyming ballads written down around 1400, I think that the poet of that rhyming ballad did know that older Eddic poem. He has a lot of elements in the story that are not in Snorri's story and that use very traditional language. I think that what we're looking at is a cousin, a sister, if you will. Look at me being Zoran Mamdani and using that about someone who's not actually blood related to me, or a text that's not blood related to another text. But I think it's a sister text to the story in Snorri's Edda. So let me tell you a little bit of the beginning of that, because it's something that I think has not been told very often or really even heard in English. Odin ruled the Aesir once and granted to all a share of gold. The Lord of gods gave men the victory when they went spear-armed to battle. Odin's people seemed strong, eager for valiant deeds. Thor was better in each skill than every man they visited at home. Everyone feared Odin's people, who never declined to use their full strength, and Jotuns left their lands in silence when Thor took Mjolnir in his hand. Loki was the name of Odin's slave, interesting note, neither good for much nor gentle. Wherever Thor might go on his journeys, Loki often changed his own form with magic. Thor told some news to Loki. Now we'll be in need of some magic. I want to meet your ungenerous namesake next, the other Loki, friend. I have heard that a wealthy man rules in Utgardar. No one knows his mother nor father. And you, Loki, will go with me. You know your magic well. So, I don't make it rhyme, because again, part of my prime purpose is to give you a very clear picture of what the original content says, not to impose new poetic structure on it. However, one thing that's also new in this book is I take about 12 pages to explain to you how Norse poetry works. So if you are interested in the structure, I have copious examples of that in the introduction, and of course, always welcome to search for the 15 or 16 videos that I've made on the subject over the years, because I think that stuff is pretty interesting, actually. But I've rambled for a few minutes. Questions, remarks? Criticism, complaints, manifestos, yes, sir.
Can you tell me what of the large time frame between the actual occurrences of gods and giants and the writing down of Snorri Sturluson back in the 12th century?
Yeah, the timeline here is really interesting because both the manuscript that we call the Codex Regius, the Poetic Edda, and the Prose Edda are written down in the 1200s, when of course Iceland is converted to Christianity in 1000. So the people writing about these myths are not the people who believe that these gods literally exist, or if they do believe in them, perhaps they think of them as sort of devils. Snorri sometimes seems to border on that. Some Runic inscriptions from this period sometimes seem to border on believing these gods exist, but that they're kind of part of Satan's army. It is looking increasingly likely, thanks to linguistic research, that these poems, the 30 or so poems that are in the Codex Regius, the Poetic Edda, largely date to the 900s. And it's really incredible how fast some of the developments in this work have been lately. There was a grad student at the University of Bergen in Norway, Leif Olsen, who published a master's thesis in 2019. And his argument, which I thought was just spot on and clear as day, was we don't know how old these poems are, but we could, because we do know the work of many Norse poets from every century. There's a long, long tradition of skaldic poetry in Scandinavian countries, and skaldic poetry is poetry of praise. Right? I write an 8-line stanza about how awesome someone is. So perhaps I want to tell you how awesome Russ is, who has put up with me since 1995. Or whenever it was we met, I don't know. That's probably right. But scholarly poetry is really very structurally complicated. So I need to rhyme and alliterate all of these different syllables, like very specific syllables have to rhyme and alliterate with other ones. So I can't ever really say exactly what I literally mean to say, because not enough words rhyme and alliterate with each other. So maybe I can't find anything to rhyme with Russ, I don't want to. So instead I call him the balder of the shield, which is a pretty typical way of just referring to a man. God name, weapon name. Right? And you just find the combination of that rhymes and alliterates with the stuff that you need. Because that poetry is so strict, we can usually date those poets within a window of 40 or 50 years, because we compare their language to the language of runic inscriptions that we can date. So building out kind of a graph of linguistic features, because we can watch things, certain grammatical features, certain vocabulary items, things like that go out of use, and you can kind of plot a graph of like, well, this word occurs, or this grammatical construction occurs like in 1 of every 100 words in 900, but it seems to occur like never by 1050. You can kind of plot out a graph like that. So Leif Olson was arguing, we can actually, why don't we do that with the Eddic poems, right, and see where they fall. And maybe it'll turn out that they really are pre-Christian, and maybe it will turn out that they're actually quite late and they're written down right around when they were composed. Either way, it's a test worth doing. And he proposed sort of how this might be done, ran some initial tests, but he didn't really have time and funding. I'm sure he had a real job too, to go through with all this. But I said to myself when I saw that, well, I'm going to do it. I'm going to go through and actually do all this. And unbeknownst to me, at Indiana University, Christopher Sapp also said, I'm going to do this. So we both independently actually ran all of these tests. We basically said, okay, here's stuff we can plot the frequency of at different points in time, and here's where the Eddic poems fall on them. And we both noticed, and I actually think it's great that we both independently did this, because not knowing about each other means that we weren't trying to agree with each other. But we both noticed that poems that have lots of archaic, have one archaic feature, have lots of other archaic features. So they cluster together, which is encouraging. It's not just that a later poet is imitating one older fashioned thing, right? Because language changes all the time. I mean, you really can often, especially in periods where people aren't quite as literate, you can often trace language change from generation to generation. Even today, you can see things changing generation to generation. I'm like the last living person who says what and where and which, right? That marks me as a living fossil. But 100 years ago, that was normal. So it's just exactly things like that that we're looking for. Like if they alliterate these two words, then that's older than if they don't alliterate these two words, that kind of thing. So most of the poems it actually looks like are, in fact, orally composed sometime around the 900s, largely probably in Norway originally, although they're written down in Iceland. Some of them are a little bit older. There are a few that may be from as old as the 800s. Some of them are later. There are, in fact, a few that probably are composed just about a generation or two before the actual manuscript was written down. But even that is interesting to me, because if you're still telling stories about Odin and Thor in 1200, that tells me that people still care, right? That this is not just a completely, this isn't transmitted by people who are sort of doing it out of a sense of duty. This is transmitted by people who care about it, think it's valuable, and continue to refer to it and rework it. I think that itself is interesting. So it surprised me, too, that some of the very oldest poems, the poems that have the biggest concentration of archaic features, are often poems that are really focused on women, which is the opposite of what a lot of literary scholars expected. Because the sort of classic understanding of this is, well, Vikings didn't care about women, which is interesting. It's like, I don't know. It's a weird expectation. But Christians care a lot more about women, which I also question the premise of. So anything that's really focused on women or is told from a woman's voice must be later. That must be somebody who's like firmly within the Christian tradition, because you would never get that in the Viking Age. But in fact, Viking Age linguistic features cluster really heavily around poems that are concentrated on women, and I don't see a reason why they shouldn't be. Right? There were women then too, I'm told. So, it's surprising. It's interesting that there are so many of them. But for example, one of the oldest poems in terms of concentration of archaic features is a poem called Gudrun Kvidda I, the first poem of Gudrun Kvidda. First poem of Gudrun, which concerns Gudrun mourning the death of her first husband, because 3 of her husbands, spoiler alert, there are tragedies with all of them. But the only speaking characters are women. And it's actually quite an emotional piece. This is part of the idea here is to do a reading. I'm going to read you a few stanzas of how this begins. This is on page 284 of the letter. Gudrun was ready for death in ancient days, when she sat in sorrow next to Sigurd's corpse. She did not weep, she did not strike with her hands, she did not scream like other women do. Wise noblemen came to her. They tried to offer some comfort to her, but Gudrun could not find the comfort of weeping, and her chest was nearly bursting with sorrow. The wives of these nobles, born to high families, sat next to Gudrun, decorated in gold. Each one of them told of her life's sorrows. Each one told of the worst she had endured. Then Gavlau, Gudrun's aunt, spoke. I live with less joy than anyone else on earth. I have endured the deaths of 5 husbands, 2 daughters, 3 sisters, and 8 brothers, and only I survive. But Gudrun could not find the comfort of weeping. She was too miserable over the death of her son, too miserable at the sight of her dead husband. And so the rest of this is mostly other women come up to her and say, my life has been worse. And try to get her to cry, and none of this makes her cry. And finally her sister comes and says, sweep the cloth you've put over the face of your dead husband, kiss him like he were alive, and that finally makes her cry. And so she finally gets the release of weeping. And I think that it's pretty interesting, but also pretty believable that women might experience these things in the Viking Age. I suspect that a fair number of brothers and husbands and sons were dying in circumstances not unlike Sigurd, and that Gudrun's poem is a reflection of the experience of the women left behind by those conflicts. So I find some of the conclusions of our recent linguistic dating criteria pretty surprising and interesting.
What languages do you have to learn to be translated?
Well, the texts themselves are in Old Icelandic. So mostly, especially with the first edition, I worked with printed editions of the Old Icelandic text. For the second edition, I checked, believe this or not, I actually checked every page of the manuscript. So that's interesting. She can attest to this. I actually have the entire Codex Regius manuscript on my phone. It's kind of fun, right? But they're very high quality scans. I also got to look at it in person again a couple years ago, which was helpful too for a couple difficult readings. Yeah, Old Icelandic is the text of the actual manuscript, and then a massive amount of the scholarship is in Scandinavian languages. So you would need to know, Swedish, Danish, or Norwegian well, and then you can read the other ones. And then you probably want to read German too, because there's a lot of scholarship in German. So, yeah, that's part of it's my job. It's my very weird job. Yeah. But it's not that hard. You had something.
With the Scandinavians being like a branch off of Germanic tribes, and the ancient Germans believing in, I think, similar gods, how divergent was that? Because, Germany was Christianized much sooner than Scandinavia. How divergent were their belief systems in the old gods, and is there anything
There's a little bit. So we know that all of the people speaking Germanic languages, so English, German, Dutch, Scandinavian languages, Gothic, in ancient times, we know that they worship gods with the same names, right? Because we get the names mentioned in texts. So, for example, in Old High German, we have the Merseburg charms. One of the Merseburg charms mentions several gods, and in the German forms of their names, so Wotan rather than Odin. We get Fol instead of Fula, Palter instead of Balder, etc. There's also some German runic inscriptions that mention names of the gods. There's the Nordendorf fibula that invokes Odin and invokes fighter Thor, and then somebody else named Logothor that we don't know, but it looks like it actually just means sorcerer. But we can't make stories out of that, right? We get names. And the same thing in English, right? We have the names of gods in our days of the week: Tuesday, Odin's Day, Thor's Day, Frigg's Day, Saturn's Day, which doesn't fit, but at any rate, we get 4 of them. Occasionally in Old English you see the gods mentioned. For example, there's something called the 9 Herbs Charm in Old English, which is a spell invoking Odin against snakebite, I'm going to say. I can't remember exactly how this goes. But basically we just have these names. It's in Iceland, and really Iceland alone, that we get stories. So we can infer that probably gods with the same name have similar roles in, say, Germany or England. Or even, we have to say, like, Denmark, because it's not like the Danes are writing down much either. But we also have to suspect that things are a little bit different, right? That, maybe so-and-so is someone's son in Iceland, but someone's brother in Germany, right? These little variations pile up all over the place. And we have a little bit of a window into that because one of our other important sources for Norse myth is written by a Dane about the same time as Snorri lived in the early 1200s, named Saxo Grammaticus, also the name of my ska band. And he tells some stories that he explicitly says were told to him by Icelanders, and then some that he says were not. And the ones that he says were not told to him by Icelanders are often fairly different from what we read in the Eddas. Like, he tells a really different story about the death of Balder than we get in the Eddas. So it looks like even between Denmark and Iceland, which are very linguistically and culturally close, there's some variation. You've got to imagine there was in Germany and England too, right? So it's lost to us exactly what the variation was, but I've got to imagine that it's not the same. Is that?
Yeah.
Give it a second.
You touched on it a little bit when you mentioned stock. So my question was, how much of this was already written down when Snorri wrote it down, as opposed to how much of it was he told and then wrote it down?
That's an interesting question. The Icelandic manuscripts that we have from the 1100s, so before Snorri's lifetime, do not concern mythology in any respect. We have genealogies, we have histories of Iceland, we have lots of saints' lives. Fans of medieval literature, you know how much medieval literature is about how cool this saint or that saint is. Some stuff about the Norwegian kings, but nothing about mythology. And Snorri, if you read the Prose Edda, which, by the way, I'm working on, I've been working on it today, so this is in progress. Snorri in the Prose Edda quotes lots of poems that are in the Poetic Edda, as well as poems that aren't. But when he quotes them, they are never word for word the same as they are in our manuscript of the Poetic Edda. There's always some little difference. So he doesn't know that manuscript, or the predecessor to that manuscript, which would have existed in his lifetime. He doesn't know someone who knows the exact same version of it. What that tells me is probably Snorri learned them orally. And he learned them from someone different from whoever wrote this learned them from, which also tells me it's somewhat widespread. Another interesting thing about that is, what does Edda mean, right? Because that's the name that Snorri gives to his book. We give it to this book, but this book actually has no name in the medieval manuscript, right? There's no title, it just goes right into the body of the text. Edda means great-grandmother. Now, you will hear other explanations of what it means, but the simplest explanation is it means the same thing as the word normally means, which is great-grandmother. And I think that what that reflects is Snorri is saying these are the kinds of stories you would hear from your great-grandmother, told the way your great-grandmother would tell them. I think that that very title reflects its oral origins, and that what he thinks he's doing is putting it to pen for the first time, and he probably is. He probably is the first person to think of writing it down. And think of all the places where this stuff doesn't get written down, right? We don't have an English Edda. We don't even have a Norwegian Edda, right? There's something special about the Icelandic cultural framework in the 1200s that makes people not only interested in doing this, but makes them value it enough to preserve it and make copies of it over time. Although it's worth noting, we have only one copy of the Poetic Edda. We have one copy of most of these poems. We have two copies of a couple individual poems that occur in one other manuscript or another, but mostly we only know them from that one manuscript. However, the prose Edda we know from 4 medieval manuscripts, so it was a little bit more widely distributed. Something here.
Yeah. Do you think there's some irony in calling stories like grandma stories because they're so violent and bloody, or do you think like they were really telling that to their toddlers and all of that?
I don't know. I haven't met your grandma, but my grandma, well, which one? One of my grandmothers tried to kill my mom 2 weeks before she died, she failed, but my mom still walks with a limp. So, yeah, I know. It doesn't not work for me. Yeah, and then my other grandma, weirdly enough, the other black sheep of the family, she, after her kids were out of the house, went back and got a master's degree in Akkadian. It's pretty rock and roll, actually. Yeah, she, so I remember talking to her about this as a kid and just being like, what's that? You know, she'd have some documents with cuneiform out on the table, and she's like, oh, I'm just practicing reading Akkadian. I'm like, what's that? She's like, well, let me tell you about Gilgamesh. So, weirdly enough, that is part of my background. But like, that's so to me, because I literally grew up hearing Gilgamesh and the Akkadian dialogue of pessimism from my grandmother, which is a really rad text, by the way. Check it out. It seems that it absolutely makes sense. Now, I don't know who Snorri's grandma was, but maybe it was someone kind of similar. We do know that his dad, and of course the way Icelandic names work, Snorri Sturluson, what was his dad's name? Sturla. Yeah. So Sturla had a fight with a neighbor woman who tried to stab one of his eyes out during the middle of the fight. And she said, while she was trying to get at him with a knife, I'm going to make you like the one you want to be, which is Odin. So it sounds like people in the area would tell, like, again, these stories were on people's lips even way after this, the gods were believed in. There was something you know that.
Yeah, you mentioned the prose Edda being kind of like ever popular, and I was sort of wondering if we have any surviving writings or any knowledge of how it was regarded when it was first written down, or similar to the Poetic Edda, I suppose.
Not really. I think that probably Snorri was regarded as kind of a weirdo. You definitely get that impression from this, because we actually know his life pretty well. His nephew, Sturla Thordarson, wrote quite a bit about him, and there's quite a bit chronicled about him in the contemporary sagas. I mean, hey, he's somebody that we know the last words of, right? Do you know this? If you go to Iceland, there's a little place you can go to called Snorraleg, modern Icelandic Snorraleg, which is literally Snorri's bath. And it is his bathtub, and he died in it. And it's a hot pot, where they pipe in geothermal water. And he was murdered in it, and his last words are, Ekki skal hopa, Ekki skal hopa, don't chop, which are 100% believable last words. Right, I mean, all the times that you get the, like, and he declaimed a final poem. So, no, that's not how people die. I thought I was dying once, and it was a lot more like Snorri. Right? So, don't chop, I believe it. So I think Snorri probably was unusual in his own time. He certainly seems to have been regarded as sort of a freak by the people around him. But not very long after his death, I think people realized the favor that he had done for them. And the very fact that we have 4 manuscripts of this surviving from medieval Iceland, that's a lot, by the way, contextually. Most medieval monasteries, any place producing books, you're going to expect lots of Bibles, lots of saint lives. So to find there were enough people interested in this to make 4 copies of it, that probably means there were 16 copies of it, right, which is actually a ton for 10,000 people in Iceland in the Middle Ages. So I think people did realize they had a treasure, but probably after his death. So maybe he's the Herman Melville of medieval Iceland. Yeah. Is there something else? Yeah.
You had mentioned Acadian, so the majority of the cuneiform corpus is like shipping manifests and receipts and really boring stuff. What was writing used for the Viking era, apparently?
So the Viking era, so before like this stuff was written down, because that's actually, that strikes at an interesting thing about our chronology. Why do we have to rely on people writing this down in the 1200s? And they did not write down stories, right? Or if they did, they're absolutely lost to us. We do have a fair amount of writing for the Viking Age, and it's in the runic alphabet, the younger Frühlight runic alphabet. The longest text that we know from the Viking Age is the Rök runestone in Rök, Östergötland, Sweden, and it's, can't remember the word count, but it's a rock about 10 feet tall, and it's written on the whole way around, so it's got to be a few hundred words, and that's enormously much. Because most of what we get are stones that say, so-and-so son of so-and-so died, I'm so-and-so son of so-and-so. He was cool, and that's about it. Maybe one more comment about one or the other. Occasionally you get something that's a little bit more interesting. For example, we have a piece of a human skull that someone drilled long after the person's death to wear as a necklace, and then carved on it, invoking a wolf and Odin and Tyr to help protect him against a dwarf and a dwarf woman. So occasionally you see that kind of thing, like a magic, like an amulet, I think is probably a proper word for that. But these are all very short texts. None of them really tell stories unless you count, my brother so-and-so was a great guy who died in England or something like that as a story. I don't know if I would. But it seems like it maybe didn't occur to people to use this to tell stories. And I wonder if that's kind of something deliberate, because in some cultures you find resistance to writing down sacred myths, right? I mean, I think about the Rig Veda, which we actually know from manuscripts that are only about as old as the Poetic Edda, but it's in Sanskrit from 1500 BC, right? It was preserved on people's lips for that long, and there are in fact injunctions against writing it down. And I wonder if there was something a little bit like that too. Like, no, you don't write this down, right? That's somebody's job to remember this. But maybe they did write it down, and we don't have that. But we actually don't have anything like paper or vellum from the Viking Age either. All the stuff they seem to be writing on is rock, metal, wood, bone, that sort of thing. Does that sort of answer your question? Okay. Can always, of course, dig deeper into these things, or point you toward, by now, 1,700 videos about most of these subjects. It's an amazing thing to think about. Other questions, remarks, criticisms, complaints, manifestos? Yeah.
One more. I watched your video talking about Jotuns,
Yeah.
and you mentioned like that they possibly weren't actually giants. You said it was probably translated as like eaters.
Hmm.
So where does this concept of them being giants come from? Is that what, some sort of Hollywood thing?
It's a little older than that. So actually, this is a good place to deal with some things that I've changed here. And one of the things that I've changed is, and I'm going to kind of come back to the specifics of your question, but one general thing that I've changed is in 2015, I wanted to anticipate the questions that my readers had and answer them. I didn't want people to finish pages with question marks in their mind. And my attitude toward that has changed quite a bit over the years. Now I feel like if I don't know what a line means, nobody is going to be able to tell you specifically what it really means. I'm going to leave it weird and ambiguous and let you have the question mark too. And that's also reflected a little bit in some of these terms. So Jotun is what they call the enemies of the gods. And that has been translated giant since at least the 19th century. And it's translated into similar things in other languages too. But the so-called giants, the Jotnar, the god's enemies, comprise most of the god's own family. right? I mean, Odin's mom is a Jotun, Thor's mom is a Jotun, Loki's dad is a Jotun, which actually seems to be the thing that stands out. Not that he's half Jotun, because all of them are, but that his dad rather than his mom is one. They are the same size because because if a father and a mother get together, you know how that works. There has to be some similarity of size. But there's no interaction between the gods and the Jotuns that imply that the Jotuns are actually bigger than they are. Their distinguishing factor is not size. There is some kind of distinction, but it actually just seems to be that the Jotuns are stronger than the gods are. Because when the gods need something really, really heavy lifted, they call on their enemies and they make some kind of deal with them. When the gods want to make a wall around Asgard to keep their enemies out, they have to have a Jotun build it, because they're not strong enough to make a wall that their enemies cannot get through. And when Baldur dies, they have to summon a Jotun to push his boat out to sea because it's loaded with so much treasure. So they have a distinguishing characteristic which really strengthens than their stature. So I've pretty much worn myself hoarse over the last 10 years or so saying, you know, giant. But what I really mean is, and then I spend 20 words explaining what I really mean. So what I decided to do is just leave it as Jotun. I figure that people who are interested in this know what that is, or at least will flip to the glossary and check. Curiously enough, it is related to the English word eat. They are apparently the eaters. Now we don't know why. I don't know if that means they're cannibals. I don't know if that means they just have huge appetites, but their name is the eaters, the devourers, I suppose you could say. If it does not sound like that would be related to eat, consider English earth versus Old Norse jord. Consider English heart versus Old Norse hjarta. So very, very often where you have an EA in English, you have a J plus vowel in Old Norse. That's a regular linguistic change without breaking. So actually eat to Jotun is a pretty regular language. Weirdly enough. Yeah, I think it's strange. Yeah.
Part of the reason they're translated as giants because they seem to have very large property, like mile deep cauldron or a huge coral.
Well, but the gods have that kind of weird stuff too, right? I mean, it's not just Jotuns that have fabulously weirdly scaled things. I think that the reason it was translated giant for so long is actually a figment of classical mythology. I think that because the Greek gods are the Olympians as opposed to the Titans, that when early translators into English and German said, well, what are we going to do with this? We can't call them Jotun. What a barbarous word. Giant is what they reached for. It's the same people who decided, I've got to add A to all the women's names. Right? It's those same 19th century translators that give us Frigga, Hella, right? Which they're Frigg and Hell, right? I have often heard it complained that if you don't know these languages, it's pretty hard to tell what names are women's names, what names are men's names. This is a complaint of yours. The family trees now address this. They have clearly marked. And it's true, yeah, if you don't know the language, it can be hard to tell that Hroth or Gloth is a woman, right? It doesn't necessarily sound like a feminine name to us, but I don't mark them with that extra artificial A. By the way, some women's names do have that A at the end. Freuda, that is real, but not Frigga. May I have time for one more? Yeah.
What are your thoughts on the argument that Frigg and Freya are iterations on one deity?
Really, really hard to know. There's evidence both ways. So some of the poets' understanding is different. So for example, in Lokasena, where Loki insults all the gods, Frigg and Freya are clearly different figures who refer to each other. That poet appears to be working very firmly within like the 900s. That looks like a pre-Christian poem by language. So it looks like certainly some believers in the pre-Christian gods think of them as different. Snorri confuses them though. So in one and the same book, in the Prose Edda, Snorri says that Loki borrows the feather suit from Frigg or from Freya. He doesn't really know or care. And I think that the similarity of their names probably encouraged a fair amount of confusion over the years. If you hold a knife to my throat and say, did pre-Christian Scandinavians think of Frigg and Freya as different? I would say different. But I think you can make an argument that it could be one goddess who got split over time, all the way really, really long time ago. And a lot of that argument I think you could make based on just the name, because Freud and Freud have titles, they're Lord and Lady. Same words in German, Frau, where God is called Frau Jo, same word in the Gothic Bible. So for example, perhaps since Frigg's name means love, originally you're dealing with one being who's like Freud and Frigg, Lady Love. But I don't know. It is also interesting that in the Western tradition we never see Freud or Freud mentioned. So if they do exist in Old English, Old High German, it's under different names than that. Travis, you had something.
Actually, might be up to the house, but in terms of dating like authenticity of pre-Christian religions, I noticed there's a difference between how Norse scholars talk about the certainty of how much we can know about Norse myth versus like Celtic studies, where that is much like we don't know anything. Do you? I don't know. I'm just related. Do you know why there's such a big lack of certainty or uncertainty? Because like the Catholic churches, I was reading a scholarship piece that was very similar to sort of noting the similarities between the god Ulf and the god Odin, and some story elements in Catholic churches that actually sort of resemble bits and pieces of Voluspa. So I was just, if you know anything.
Yeah, I don't know exactly why they have more issues with this, although I'll point out that in Celtic, you look at Old Irish, and then you look at Ogham Irish, and you have things that are supposedly written within about 100 years of each other, and you see huge, massive, like serious intelligibility differences between them. It's like, we may not have a great idea of the chronology of these languages actually, but I'm not a specialized Celticist. I've certainly studied these languages to some extent. I would imagine they could do some of the same things we're doing now, but it takes a big corpus that you can already date, and that may be what's sort of lacking in Celtic studies. With the Skaldic corpus being something we can date, especially relative to our pretty rich, although vocabulary limited, but pretty rich corpus of runic inscriptions, we're in a better position to say, here's our control, here's our variable, how does the variable line up with the control? I don't know if they have quite as much of the stuff they can actually date more objectively in the Celtic studies world, especially with some questions about exactly how old is, what do we look? Some Middle Welsh texts people think are like 1,000 years older than the manuscript they're written on. And I don't know why. I don't actually know enough about Middle Welsh to know what the criteria for that is. All right, is that our time? All right, folks, I appreciate you. And I'll be up here if anybody wants to come chat, get something signed or whatever. For now, I wish you all the best.